Hello, my name is Rod MacDonald, and I'm introducing a film that was shot by Carl Dare in 1956 showing the hand-making of metal typefaces. The story of this film actually began over a cup of coffee one morning between Canadian graphic designer Carl Dare and a man named Alan Jarvis, who was at that time the head of the National Art Gallery in Ottawa. Dare was complaining that no Canadian had ever cut a typeface, and he felt this was, beneath the dignity of any country. Dare really wanted to produce a typeface. He had the design skills, but he didn't feel he had the technical knowledge to do this. So Jarvis encouraged him to apply for a government grant and to study type founding abroad. So Dare did this, and of course in 1956 received $4,000 to study at the renowned firm of Joh Enschede in Haarlem in Holland. And more importantly, he was going to study under a man named Paul Radish, who was at that time the last traditional metal punch cutter or letter engraver in the world. During his time at Enschede, Dare did something rather remarkable. He brought a camera, a 16mm camera, and he shot footage of Radish cutting a typeface. There have been other films of this nature made before, but they were all staged films. This was the only one that we know of where it was actually a living master. This is one of the only films to show a traditional letter engraver at work. We don't know exactly the date that this film was shot. We know that Dare started at Enschede in August of '56. A good guess would be that this film was shot sometime in the spring of 1957. Along with shooting the film, Dare also wrote a series of articles for Canadian Printer and Publisher. They really are worthy of study. Dare made 2 copies of this film. One is in the museum at Enschede, and the second one went into the Carl Dare archives at Massey College in the University of Toronto. The restored digital version you are about to see was made using the Massey College copy. The film was largely ignored until around 1992 when a man named Robert Norton, who was then type director at Microsoft, convinced the librarian at Massey to lend him the film, which he took back to Seattle and had a VHS tape made. This allowed the film to be shown for the first time outside the college. Shortly after, I was allowed to make a copy of that VHS, and I would show it to my students. In 1999, at the A-Type I conference in Boston, Mike Parker was showing a series of type-related films, and this was one of them. Matthew Carter, one of the world's leading type designers, was also there, and Matthew and I started talking, and we agreed on a couple of things. One was that the film should be restored, and the second, and perhaps most important, was that Matthew should narrate this film. He had studied the year before Dare under Radish at Enschede, and he was the only person alive at that time who had done that. Fortunately, Donna Braggins at Sheridan in Oakville, just outside Toronto, stepped up and said that Sheridan would do what it takes to both restore the film, do the interview with Matthew, and record his voiceover. So full credit goes to Sheridan for this final production. I would have been quite happy just to have seen this film restored, but now when I watch it with Matthew Carter's narration, I just can't imagine it any other way. And the addition of him talking about his time at Enschede is almost equally important to me as the original film. Carl Dare did actually achieve his goal of creating Canada's first Latin typeface, and in 1967 he released a typeface called Cartier. It was named after Jacques Cartier, the French discoverer of Canada. Canada's first Latin typeface was never cut in metal. By the time Dare released it in 1967, metal was finished. However, by making this film right at the end of the era, Dare made an enormous contribution to our understanding of that first 500 years of type founding. These punch cutters and letter engravers, they were the people who took the handwritten alphabets of the scribes and carved them in steel and gave them the form of our alphabet today.
The typeface used for this introductory title is Romanet, designed by Jan van Krimpen, and cut as punches by Paul Radish. Here you see some of Romanet italic. We're in the town of Haarlem in the Netherlands, beautiful town. We're doing a little tourism before we get down to work. That is what's called the Amsterdam Gate in the background, part of the old fortifications of Haarlem. Haarlem's about 15 minutes from Amsterdam by train. Here's another view of this ancient building. Bridge over the canal. The town hall of Haarlem, medieval building, beautiful thing standing right in the center of town on the big market square. And this is the home of the star of the film, Paul Radish. We see him leaving home in the morning on his way to work. The year is 1957. Mr. Radish was 65 at this time, and in fact he retired later in this year. Here he is passing the statue of Lawrence Coster, who at one time was thought to have been the inventor of printing from movable type, a decade or two ahead of Gutenberg. Here he is brandishing a piece of type. I'm not sure how seriously that claim is taken by historians now, but he's revered in his birthplace, Haarlem, and Mr. Radish salutes him on his way to work. This is Enschede's, the historic printing works, right on in the center of town. The nameplate. And here we are going in the employee's entrance, which Mr. Radish has done for the past 47 years. We're now in the punch cutter's room in the foundry, Mr. Radish arriving. And we meet the second member of the cast, Henk Drost, young man who's been trained as Radish's assistant, but by now is in fact an extremely accomplished punch cutter in his own right, helping Mr. Radish on with his work coat. Here we are at the punch cutter's bench. Mr. Radish sits on the left-hand side, Henk Drost on the right, and there's a place in the middle for trainees. Cleaning his loop at the start of the day and showing us the first view of what will become a punch. This is a short billet of annealed steel that's been hacksawed from a square section rod. It's about 2¼ inches long. And the first process is to true up two adjacent sides of it with a rather large file, very expertly handled by Henk here. And here comes Sem Hartz, artistic director, playing the part of a designer, showing Radish a letter that he wishes to have cut as a punch. It's that capital P you see there, Petit Canon. This is in fact a historical letter. It dates from 1570. It was cut by Robert Grandjon for Plantin, what Plantin called Ascendonica, we would call 24-point. Truing up the blank for the punch, making sure the sides are flat and square to one another. Now starting work on the face end of the punch to square that off, again with this large file expertly handled. More consultations between Sem and Mr. Radish. Thank you, Sem. You see a nick has been filed across one of the sides of the blank close to the butt end to indicate, like on a piece of type, that is parallel to the baseline of the letter. Mr. Radish confirming that Henk has got it all trued up nicely. You can see that the arises and corners have been chamfered just to make the shank easier to hold. Final test that the face is at right angles to the shank. Polish on a piece of emery cloth. This is the facing gauge, and Radish is about to scribe with an etching needle some guidelines on the blank face of the punch that will position the letter. Here you see it as a smoke impression on a piece of cellophane, which Radish is burnishing down onto the face of the punch. Here it is, an image in smoke on the punch. Now he's going around the contours of the letter very delicately because the smoke will rub off as he works on the letter. These are Radish's gravers, different profiles in a rack in front of him. Starting to work now, digging out the counters. Notice how the graver is always held over his thumb. It's kind of pushed with his thumb. He's hollowing out the counters. There's one, of course, inside the bowl of the P. There's a second one between the bottom of the bowl and the top of the foot serif, sharpening his graver on an Arkansas stone with oil. Further work on the counters, digging with what looks like a flat chisel-shaped scorper, working the inner counters of the punch. Mr. Radish liked to smoke cigars, so a lot of tools and knickknacks were kept in cigar boxes. Here are his files. I think this is a three-cornered file. You see him starting to file up the back of the stem of the letter P, shaping the contour. Holding the punch against this wooden peg, very well worn, as you see, from years of use, and again continuing to file the shoulders of the punch up to the face. This is an important tool. It holds the punch at exactly right angles, perpendicular to this stone. It's a slate stone. It's a very soft abrasive used for polishing the face of the punch. And here Radish has put it back into the facing gauge to confirm that the stem of the P is exactly upright. All these gauges have to be made. You can't go to a store and buy such a thing. They have to be made in the foundry. Lighting a candle flame, holding the punch delicately in the flame to deposit a little soot on the face. And then back to that facing tool to print it very lightly on a piece of coated paper, a smoke proof. So for the first time you can examine the letter as it will appear, the right way round. Sharpening the graver again. Looks as though he's shaving a little bit more metal off the inner contour of the counter here. Back to the cigar box for another file. A rat's tail, I think it is. Working on the serif brackets, filing the serif brackets at the foot of the letter P. Again, held against this wooden peg. See how beautifully finished the shoulders of the punch are, this kind of glossy effect that you get from very skillful filing. So now a critical stage of hardening the punch. It's put in this holder over a Bunsen burner. And when it's hot enough, it is quenched, plunged into water. The hardening process leaves some oxidization on the steel, which has to be polished off so you can see the color of the steel. This is the blank for the matrix. It's a copper block which has been squared up, and the face side of it is burnished to remove any scratches. This is the jig that hold the punch and the matrix together in the striking press. It's like a cage. It comes apart. In the bottom of it is placed the blank, the copper blank, held in position with a spring and screws. and the top plate is put back on its pillars, and the punch is then inserted into this jig where it's held by a spring exactly perpendicular to the blank. You can see the punch being offered here to the surface of the blank copper matrix. This is the press, a mighty lever press. It has to generate considerable force to strike the punch into the matrix. It's a lever press with a cam mechanism that depresses a piston that in turn drives the punch. Here is Henk getting it lined up properly under the press. And here he goes, pulling this long lever down. And the punch is now being driven into the softer metal of the copper blank. Final shove. So now dismantling the jig, and you see the punch has been driven into the matrix, the strike, and Henk is now removing it. You see the impression in the copper. Oh dear, a dreadful moment. The punch is actually broken in the course of striking. It's split clean in half. But apparently the matrix is usable. This is the justifying machine. It's a glorified milling machine with very, very precise adjustments. And this is Otto Huppeler, a very patient and exacting man who did the justification of the matrices with this very specialized machine. Here's Otto testing with a depth gauge to make sure that the face of the letter depressed in the matrix is exactly parallel to the surface of the matrix and at the right depth. If it's not at the right depth, then the type cast in it won't have the right height to paper. Here is the finished justified matrix emerging from the justifying machine, holding it up so we can see the letter P. Here it's going into the casting machine. We're out now on the foundry floor. Caster placing the matrix over the mold. Type metal, lead alloy, will now be injected into the mold and the matrix. And here you see the cast sorts coming out of the casting machine. So here are the three stages. The punch, alas, in two pieces, the finished matrix, and then lastly a bunch of the sorts would have just been cast in the machine. This, I think, is the photograph of the punches of one of Van Krimpen's faces, Cancelleresca bastarda, and here are the smoke proofs from when this was cut by Radish at a former time. So the end of the day, unfortunately, a day's work lost because the punch broke, a rare occurrence, but it does sometimes happen. Radish cleaning up his gauges and tools. Rust is the great enemy of these beautiful tools, so they have to be wiped at the end of the day, cleaning off the sharpening stone. And Henk, again, acting as valet to get Mr. Radish dressed for the outdoors. Off we go. The firm of Enskede's, Johannes Enschede and Zonen, to give them their full title, yes. A very unique business, very ancient established printing works in Haarlem with many different departments. They're perhaps best known as security printers. They printed a lot of banknotes and stamps, some of them designed on the premises. Also very high-class general color printers. But they were, I would say, probably unique at the time this film was made, in other words, in the 1950s, in having their own type foundry. They made their own type in-house, a thing that most printers had given up in the first half of the 16th century, when with the establishment commercial type foundries. But Enschede's continued to make their own type. So this little film made by Carl Dare really records the end of an era. Dare was one of 3 trainees, we'd now call them interns, who spent time at Enschede's thanks to a very generous outlook on the part of the management of Enschede's, who encouraged people to come and spend some time learning skills as trainees in the factory at large, not only in the foundry. I went there in the autumn of 1955, and I stayed until the summer of 1956. And towards the end of my time there, I did actually meet Carl Dare, because I don't know if he was just visiting or whether by that time he had moved with his wife and daughters to Harlem. He came on a grant from the Canadian government, who funded this training session that he went through at Enschede's. And he spent several months, as I had done before him, learning to cut punches by hand. The person we studied under, who was the subject of this film, Paul Radish, was about to retire. He was 65 years old at the time this movie was made. It was 1957. And he retired later that same year. So this was sort of the last moment where the technique that is filmed could have been documented. It was a pleasure for me to watch this movie that Carl made, because I realized that Radish has sort of mellowed a good deal by the time Carl got there. And I think this is partly a tribute to Carl Dare, who was himself a very friendly, affable fellow, and I think sort of drew Radish out, perhaps more than us predecessors as trainees. Radish, of course, was not a designer. That was the role of Van Krimpen or Sem Hartz or others. He was the person who made the type to someone else's design. He was a translator, if you like. My father, Harry Carter, was the first person, I think, to mention the part that Radish played in the making of Van Krimpen's typefaces. I'm not exactly sure how this happened, but I assume my dad reviewed maybe Lutetia or one of Van Krimpen's designs and mentioned the fact that Radish had cut the punches, which had never been proclaimed before, at least in public. So Radish was grateful to my dad and had met him a number of times, and so I was made welcome as a trainee. Henk Drost, who of course also appears in this film, actually did more of the instruction than Radish did. I'm sure this was true with Carl. It was certainly true of me. Henk had a few words of English, which Radish did not, and until I picked up enough Dutch to be able to converse in the workroom, certainly Henk was the main instructor, I would say. Radish had always resisted the idea of training anyone else for years and years and years, despite the management obviously wanting him to do so that he would have a successor. But he eventually introduced Henk Drost. I think Drost's family were friendly with Radish and his wife. So Henk came in as a trainee and was extremely gifted. He mostly worked on large faces, as well as cutting punches in steel. Sem Hartz, on the other hand, he was a designer, engraver of stamps. He designed and engraved many of the stamps that Enschede produced. Sem did, of course, design typefaces himself. He designed a face called Emergo, I Emerge, which was made by Enschede's. And then later on, he designed a beautiful face called Juliana for British Linotype. He was a great help to me, and I'm sure to Carl, because Sem spoke perfect English. Sem often was a sort of intermediary, very, very willing to facilitate communication between us and so on. The one occasion when I met Carl Dare, when he showed up in the type foundry at Enschede's, I distinctly remember Sem saying what a nice man Carl was. I'm sure that during Carl's tenure that he and Sem would have got on very well. Otto Huppelaar, who we see very briefly operating the justifying machine, a very nice and very friendly guy who explained his process very carefully to me. I didn't actually get to operate the machine, and maybe that's just as well, because it was a very delicate machine, and And Otto had acquired a great deal of skill in using it, and I hate to think what I might have done if I'd been let loose with it. But he was very, like everyone in the foundry, they were very kind to us trainees. Again, just to talk a little bit about Radish's personality, he had mellowed a lot by the time this film was made. And also I was told, I love this story, that at a certain time in the past, the management had tried to introduce an engraving machine, a pantographic machine, into the studio, into the type foundry, which obviously at that time Radish resented very much. Gradually this machine disappeared. I mean, it literally dematerialized. And what happened, I think, was that every day as he left work, Radish would take a part of this machine, put it in his pocket, then drop it in the canal as he went home. So this machine never got to work. Radish made his feelings about this very well known. Radish's attitude had sort of softened a good deal by the time I got there, which was good, because it obviously meant that he was more cooperative, more open to revealing all of these extraordinary skills that he had learnt. The people in the foundry were very kind and very helpful to people like me. You know, I was 18 when I got there, and you know, complete beginner. I mean, I had no background in this at all. They had all sorts of extraordinary stories to tell about wartime, because of course the Netherlands were occupied by the Germans during the war, and Enschede, as an enormously competent, wide-ranging printing facility, was very closely supervised by the occupying Germans. But nonetheless, they managed somehow to build within the factory a sort of secret room, forging identity cards and all sorts of other documents, which of course they had the competence to do. They were expert printers of all kinds. So although it was 10 years after the war, by the time I got there in 1955, this was still on people's minds. And you heard these anecdotes about the enemy occupation of the Netherlands. Sem Hartz, who was Jewish, had to go into hiding during the war, and he quite literally spent most of the occupation in a cupboard in a friend's house in Haarlem. So these wartime experiences were still very much on people's minds when I was there. Broadly speaking, you could say that there were two schools of punch cutting. One we see in this film. It's obviously the one that Radish learnt in Leipzig. This is a technique which is similar to engraving in a way. The internal spaces within the letter forms, the counters, are dug out with engraving tools. It's quite a complex process. We follow it a little bit in the film. There's more to it than we see. But essentially it is done by digging out the counters with the appropriate tools. It's skillful work, but it is only one of the ways of making the counters in a punch. The older way, which was not practiced by Radish, although he knew a lot about it, he favoured his technique. He favoured the engraving technique because he said that it didn't disturb the consistency of the steel. When you were engraving, you didn't distort the steel. The other process uses counterpunches to make the recesses, the counters in the punch. What you do is you cut and shape and harden a small punch, and then you hit that, you strike that into the surface of the punch to make a hollow. So rather than digging the metal out, you are driving it in with a counterpunch. When exactly the technique Radish used, the engraving technique, came in, I'm not sure, but there were still punch cutters who used the counterpunch technique until relatively modern times. There are two parts of this film which I don't think are really fully explained in the film, so I thought I might elaborate a bit about those. The first is how the image of the letter, a capital P in the case of the film, gets onto the surface of the punch. The practice was they would make a line block, a shallow etched copper line block, reduced to the correct size, to type size, in other words. That would then, the little piece of copper plate would then be held in a candle flame to deposit soot on it. A piece of cellophane would be laid over it and burnished lightly to lift the soot image off the line block onto the piece of cellophane. That was then used to transfer the soot impression onto the face of the punch, and you do see that in the film. A little bit of mastic was dabbed on the face of the punch to make it sticky, and then using the guidelines which had been scribed onto the face of the punch, the soot image of the P is transferred and burnished down. So that, I think, is a fuller explanation of that process, which is not perhaps obvious from the film itself. The other thing, which is a little bit glossed over, and it's relevant because of what happens at the end of the film, concerns the hardening of the punch. When you are cutting the punch, you're working on annealed steel, which is soft and workable. But if you tried to strike the punch into copper, even as soft a metal as copper, with the steel in its annealed state, it would bend. It would be terrible. So at the final stage, when the cutting of the punch is finished, it has to be hardened. And to do that, it is brought in a Bunsen burner to a cherry red color and then quickly quenched in water, plunged in water. That hardens the punch, but it leaves it too hard. It is then brittle hard. If you struck the punch into copper at that stage, it would shatter. It would be like glass. It would fall apart. So the next step, the final step really, is a very delicate one. As you saw in the film, the hardening leaves a little sort of scale on the steel. That has to be polished off so you can see the color of the steel very accurately. Then the steel is brought back a little bit from this very hard state. It's tempered. And the way that is done, to heat it very gently over indirect heat. And you watch it very carefully until the tapered end of the punch turns a light straw color. And at that point, you quench it again, and it is then ready to be used. It's still hard, but it's no longer brittle. If you temper it too much, so the steel turns brown or even eventually blue, like spring steel, it will be too elastic and it will bend when you strike it. So there's a great deal of skill and experience required to judge exactly the right color of tempering before the punch is finally struck. In the film, as we saw, the punch breaks. This is a rare occurrence in my experience, but it does happen sometimes. Occasionally you can be really unlucky and there's a flaw in the steel, which obviously doesn't get revealed until you put the pressure of the striking press on it. Or maybe it was not correctly tempered. I mean, we don't know. But these disasters, which cost Radish a day's work, were relatively rare, I must say. By the time I'd spent this time at Enschede's, I had really learnt an obsolete trade. I mean, frankly, in commercial terms, it was obsolete. So I did cut a few punches. I cut some binders brasses for Oxford, but I quickly had to change from trying to make type to designing type. I don't for a moment regret that time I spent at Enschede's because I had this very traditional training myself. I sometimes get into conversation with students now. I'm very glad that I learnt to make type before I could design it, because for me, designing and making are not things I can disassociate in my mind. I can't take those things apart. They say, well, that was a very long-winded way to work. I mean, how many letters could you do in a day? And I would say, well, 1 if I'm lucky. They say, well, I can do 20 in a day. But I say, at the end of the day, you have to make a decision. I mean, what you're trying to learn is judgment. When I was trying to cut punches, if I made a mistake, I lost a day's work. In other words, it was very expensive to make a mistake. What does this do to you? It makes you think long and hard before you hit the chisel with the mallet. It makes you, as a punch cutter, have a very precise idea in your mind of what you're going to do before you do it, because it's very hard to change your mind midstream with a punch. Nowadays, you have a different option. You can produce 20 different versions of something in the time it took me to do one. Now what you've got to do is choose the right one among the 20. So that's how you develop your judgment now. by giving yourself more choices. I never had that luxury. I mean, I couldn't really cut, well, I could have done, I could have cut 20 different punches of the same letter, I suppose, but that's 20 days gone by. You know, you can't really afford the time to do that. So those are two very different approaches, and again, I'm very open-minded about how someone would approach type design nowadays. Most type designers are essentially self-taught. There are a couple of schools now that offer MA degrees in type design, but essentially the motivation, I think, has to come from a sort of inner drive. So how you get into it is in some ways not so important, I think.